The devil's breath. The devil's breath belched forth a wave of flat beer and an undercurrent of something fouler coating the cracked earth at Sarah's scuffed boots. From the saloon's yawning entrance, a fractured piano tune seeped like a sordid secret. She hesitated, the thin fabric of her dress suddenly a paltry shield against the imagined scrutiny within. A viper's nest, they called it, where fortunes evaporated faster than morals. But morals hadn't filled her belly since Thomas's absence. Sarah drew herself up, a familiar throb in her lower back a constant companion. Wringing her hands wouldn't conjure supper. She needed grit, fortitude, a quality she wasn't sure she possessed. With a breath thick with dust and despair, she nudged the doors open. An interior pandemonium crashed over her, raucous voices, guffaws, the clinking of glass, all vying with the relentless piano. Tobacco smoke, heavy as a suffocating blanket, clung to her skin. Men, their faces maps of hard luck and harder choices, populated the bar, their gazes a blend of appraisal and contempt settling on her. At scattered tables, women adorned with garish makeup and flamboyant silks raised voices that pierced the din. Sarah felt a telltale heat crawl up her neck. She was a wren amongst peacocks, utterly out of place. The bar itself ran the room's length, a scarred veteran bearing witness to countless spilled hopes and shattered illusions. Behind it stood a figure seemingly hewn from stone, his face a craggy landscape of deep lines and shadowed plains. His powerful arms moved with the practiced grace of a seasoned performer as he dispensed drinks and collected coin. The barkeep, Jebediah, she believed. He was the only one who gave her more than a cursory glance, his eyes like winter steel assessing her. Fortifying herself, Sarah approached the bar. The wood felt coarse beneath her trembling fingertips. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice little more than a breath. Jebediah ignored her, continuing to polish a glass with a rag that had clearly lived a full life. Sarah tried again, a notch louder. "Excuse me, sir." He ceased his ministrations, setting the glass down with a deliberate thud. His eyes, the shade of a squall at sea, locked onto her. "Well, now, what brings you here, little dove? Looks like you've strayed from the flock." Ignoring the jab, Sarah said, "I'm looking for work." Jebediah arched a skeptical brow, his gaze sweeping from her worn boots to her simple attire. "Work? Here? What makes you think we've got a use for the likes of you?" I'm good at cleaning," she stammered. "I can cook. I'm diligent." "Cleaning and cooking, eh?" A dry, rasping chuckle escaped him. "This ain't no genteel parlor, missy. We need muscle and quick wits, not some wildflower about to faint in the heat." Sarah's cheeks flared. She wasn't beautiful, not refined. She was simply made. Thomas had always insisted it was a good kind of plain, steady, and true. But Thomas wasn't here to say it anymore. "I'm stronger than I appear," she insisted, meeting his gaze squarely. "And I learn quickly." Jebediah leaned in, his breath a miasma of whiskey and stale tobacco. "Learn what, exactly?" "How to serve drinks to a pack of rowdy cowboys. How to entertain them when they're feeling lonesome." Sarah recoiled slightly, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "No," she stated firmly, her voice gaining purchase. "I'm not that sort of woman." "Then what sort are you?" he challenged, his eyes narrowing to slits. She hesitated, searching for the precise phrasing. "I'm the sort who needs a living," she declared finally. "The sort who isn't afraid of honest labor. The sort who'll do what's required to survive." Jebediah scrutinized her for what felt like an eternity, his expression an impenetrable mask. The saloons didn't seem to recede as their eyes remained locked. She refused to yield, refusing to betray her fear. At last, he sighed, the sound burdened with the weight of ages. "All right," he conceded, his voice rough as gravel. "I might have something. But don't get any fanciful notions. It's not pretty, and it's far from easy." Hope sparked in Sarah's chest, a tenuous flame in the encompassing gloom. "I understand. You'll be scrubbing," Jebediah informed her, gesturing with a dismissive wave. "Every morning before the rooster crows. Emptying chamber pots, scouring floors, polishing glasses. And you'll be assisting the cook with the dishes. He's a miserable codger, so don't expect any accolades." "I can manage that," Sarah replied, relief flooding her voice. "The pay's negligible," Jebediah continued, "barely enough to keep body and soul together. You'll be bunking in the back, in a small room off the kitchen. It's nothing to write home about, but it's dry." "It's more than I possess at present," Sarah said, gratitude coloring her tone. Jebediah grunted. "Don't thank me just yet. This establishment isn't for the faint of heart. You'll witness things that'll haunt your dreams. Things that'll make you long for the quiet life of a widow." He paused, his eyes boring into hers once more. Are you certain you're up to it, little dove? This is the devil's breath after all. It devours the vulnerable and leaves them hollow. Sarah surveyed the saloon, the faces of the men etched with hardship, their eyes reflecting desperation, the women, smiles brittle, laughter manufactured, the very walls steeped in a palpable darkness. Yet, amid it all, she detected a glimmer of something else. A shared resilience, a mutual understanding born of adversity. A sense of belonging, however fleeting. She remembered Thomas, his gentle smile and calloused hands, the life they had carved out together, no matter how brief. She considered the future she yearned for, a future where she could fend for herself, discover a measure of serenity. Yes, she answered, her voice unwavering. I'm certain. Enter Calamity. The pianola's tinny clamor, once the ragged heartbeat of the saloon's boisterous energy, sputtered and quit. Silence dropped, heavy and immediate, clinging denser than the sour tang of spilled ale. Even Jebediah, whose usual bar wiping possessed the fervor of a man fighting off bees, halted mid-swipe, his arm frozen. Sarah, grappling with a stubborn ring on a table leg, sensed the alteration in the air, a stark stillness pregnant with unspoken threat. She risked a peek. Framed in the entrance, a silhouette against the fiery hues of the sunset, stood a figure hewn from stone. Gaunt and imposing, he wore a long coat that shifted in the non-existent wind, concealing the finer points of his build. But the tight-wound tension in his posture was undeniable, a palpable menace radiating from him like the heat from sun-baked earth. A well-worn holster rode low on his hip, the leather whispering stories of quick draws and final stands. Calamity Clay. The name echoed in the abrupt void, a ghost of a word carried on the arid breeze. Sarah had heard the yarns, of course. Everyone had. Tales spun around crackling fires, splashed across the pages of gaudy storybooks, likely embellished, yet always underscored by an undeniable kernel of fact. Clay was a force elemental, unpredictable, and ruinous. He advanced then, crossing the threshold. The saloon's gloom revealed a face leathered by sun and shadow, carved with the deep runnels of hardship and conflict. His eyes, an unnerving glacial gray, swept the room, each pass a tangible weight that prickled Sarah's skin. The poker players petrified, cards clutched like lifelines, their swagger dissolving like frost under a noonday sun. A painted woman, teetering on a barstool, snapped upright, her laughter choked off in its infancy. Even Jebediah seemed to diminish behind the polished wood, bluster replaced by an appraising watchfulness. Clay's gaze cruised past the gamblers, the woman, the barkeep, and then, inexplicably, it snagged. It locked on Sarah. She felt skewered, pinned by the force of his scrutiny. Her breath snagged. He held her captive for what felt like eons, those gray eyes dissecting her, dismantling her flimsy defenses, leaving her raw and vulnerable. She yearned to disappear, to become one with the floorboards, to fade into the scenery. A wave of shame washed over her. She was acutely aware of the smudges on her dress, the stray tendrils of hair escaping her bun, the very ordinariness of her features. She was nothing, a nonentity, a mere smudge in the face of such raw power. Her first urge was to recoil, to retreat into the shadows, to shrink into insignificance. Her eyes fell to the rough-hewn floor, anything to escape that unsettling inspection. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Finally, blessedly, his gaze moved on. He strolled to the bar, his spurs chiming softly on the planks, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. "Whiskey," he stated, his voice a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the saloon. It was a simple request, yet it carried the weight of a decree. Jebediah, visibly relieved to have his focus shifted, fumbled to pour the drink, his hands betraying a tremor. Sarah remained rooted, her muscles coiled, her senses hyper-alert. Even though Clay no longer looked her way, she felt his presence, a tangible force that pressed down on her lungs. She could feel the other's eyes boring into her, a blend of pity and morbid fascination. They were waiting, she knew, for the dam to break. They were waiting to see what calamity Clay would unleash. And so was she. She tried to resume scrubbing, but her hands trembled too violently to grip the rag. The stain remained, a dark taunt against the worn wood. She closed her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath, attempting to gather a shred of composure. She had to be resilient. She had to endure. She had to. A shadow eclipsed her. She startled, her eyes flying open. Calamity Clay loomed before her, his towering form blotting out the meager light. He held a glass of whiskey, untouched, in his hand. He was looking at her once more, his expression an enigma. Sarah's breath hitched. What did he want? An unexpected shield. The whiskey churned in Sarah's gut, a sickening weight mirroring the anxiety gnawing at her. Calamity Clay hadn't stirred, his gaze unwavering as he downed the amber fluid. The air in the saloon thickened, stretched tight like the skin of a drum about to burst. Then the fragile peace shattered. A cowboy named Hank, perpetually red-faced from cheap rockgut and relentless sun, lurched in her direction. He stank of sweat, stale beer, and a faint, unsettling sourness she couldn't identify. "Well, ain't you a daisy in a dustbin?" he drawled, his words slurred and thick. Sarah recoiled, flattening herself against the rough plank wall. Attention, especially from the likes of Hank, was a curse. His stare felt invasive, a clammy hand on her soul. "Lost your voice, little bird?" Hank persisted, extending a grimy paw. Sarah flinched, her breath hitching. "Don't fret none. Hank here likes a quiet one. Makes them pliable." He winked, the gesture lewd and unsettling. The other patrons watched with morbid curiosity, their expressions a blend of amusement and grim fascination. No one intervened. They never did. "Leave her be, Hank," a voice rumbled from the shadows. It was a voice imbued with warning, edged with the promise of retribution. Calamity Clay hadn't raised his voice, hadn't altered his stance, but the menace rolled across the room like thunder. Hank, fueled by liquor and the tacit approval of his cronies, puffed up his chest. "And what skin is it off your nose, Clay? Thought you'd prefer something with a little more padding." He lasered her with a slimy look, then back at Clay. "Besides, the little thing looks like she could use some chair and up." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, wishing herself invisible. She longed to be anywhere else, facing anything else. The saloon, its floor littered with sawdust and the air thick with smoke, felt like a cage closing around her. Clay remained still for what felt like an age, his hawk-like eyes pinned on Sarah. It was an eternity. Then, with a swiftness that belied his bulk and reputation, he uncoiled. He moved with the fluid grace of a panther, a predator stalking its prey. But instead of aggression, he moved deliberately towards Sarah. Hank, momentarily silenced, watched him approach. A flicker of doubt sparked in his eyes, but he held his ground, too drunk and too stubborn to yield. Clay halted directly before Sarah, his imposing frame an impenetrable barrier against Hank's gaze. He remained silent, unmoving. Then he reached up and began unbuttoning his coat. It was a coat of midnight black, fashioned from dense, heavy wool. It looked incongruous, a touch of elegance amidst the grime and decay. Slowly, purposefully, Clay settled the coat around Sarah's shoulders. The coarse wool scratched against her skin, but its weight was strangely grounding. It carried the scent of leather, wood smoke, and something else, something indefinably wild and feral. The coat enveloped her, transforming her from a target of scorn into something shielded. Clay took a step back, his focus now entirely on Hank. "I believe the lady is feeling a chill," he stated, his voice a low, simmering threat. Hank, finally comprehending the gravity of his misjudgment, swallowed audibly. The bluster evaporated from his face, replaced by a sheepish, almost fearful expression. "Just funnin', Clay," he mumbled, retreating hastily. "Didn't mean nothin' by it?" He scuttled back to his table, muttering under his breath, avoiding Clay's scorching gaze. The other patrons, sensing the shift in the balance of power, swiftly lost interest in the drama. The saloon resumed its murmuring conversation, the tension slowly bleeding away. Sarah stood transfixed, Clay's coat a heavy burden. She didn't dare to stir, didn't dare to speak. She couldn't fathom what had transpired, why Calamity Clay, a man who inspired fear in everyone, had chosen to intercede on her behalf. He hadn't struck a blow, hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply covered her. And in that single gesture, he had silenced Hank and restored a fragile semblance of normalcy to the saloon. A chance at redemption. Clay watched Hank blunder out of the saloon, whispering apologies to the dusty boards. The air, heavy with stale hops and unvoiced worries, seemed to compress. He pivoted towards Jeb, who buffed the already gleaming bar with frantic energy. "Jeb," Clay rumbled, his voice a quiet thunder that sliced through the room's low drone. "Put the girl to work." Jeb's hand froze mid-wipe, his mouth agape. "Work? Clay, with them lot? They'll never." His voice died, eyes skittering toward Sarah, who still lingered by the entrance, her worn satchel clutched tight. Clay's gaze chilled. "They'll heed my word. Kitchen detail. Washing dishes. Enough for a room overhead and grub." He paused, his eyes flicking back to Sarah. She possessed a distinct delicacy, a vulnerability that clashed with the town's rough edges. "See it done, Jeb." Jeb gulped, nodding vigorously. "Right, Clay? Right away." He scurried toward Sarah, forcing a welcoming smile. "Miss, Metasweet," Sarah supplied, her voice barely audible. "Sarah Metasweet. Right, Miss Metasweet. Jeb's the name. Clay wants you lending a hand in the kitchen. Come on, I'll show you around." He indicated a door at the saloon's rear, his earlier reluctance dissolved by Clay's command. Sarah hesitated, glancing back at Clay. He remained a still figure near the bar, an unreadable sentinel. Drawing a long breath, she followed Jeb toward the kitchen, her satchel thumping against her side. The kitchen presented a stark contrast to the saloon's relative order. A cacophony of clanging pots, sizzling pans, and a miasma of stew and frying meat filled the air. A frazzled cook, his apron a Jackson Pollock of unknown stains, barely registered her as Jeb made introductions. "Maggie, this is Sarah. She'll be on dish duty." Maggie grunted, gesturing towards a towering mountain of dirty plates and silverware beside a yawning sink. "Get to it then. Quit gawking." Sarah nodded, setting down her satchel and pushing up her sleeves. The water was tepid and slick with grease, but she offered no complaint. She started scraping remnants into a refuse bucket, the rhythmic chime of cutlery providing a small measure of solace in the clamorous kitchen. She worked with a practiced efficiency honed over years on the farm. The labor was far from glamorous, but honest and represented opportunity. A chance to earn her keep, to prove her worth, to forge a new life. Despite her efforts, she felt observed. She glanced up occasionally, seeing only Maggie snapping orders at the staff, Jeb flitting between saloon and kitchen. Yet, the feeling persisted, a faint tingle on the back of her neck. Finally, she saw him, framed in the saloon doorway, partially swallowed by shadow. Clay. He didn't look directly at her, but his gaze seemed to absorb the entire kitchen, noting every detail. His presence was unsettling, yet also oddly protective. He'd extended this opportunity, this lifeline. Why? She couldn't decipher his motives. Pity? A spontaneous act of charity? Or something deeper? She returned to her task, attacking a stubborn stain on a plate, attempting to ignore the weight of his scrutiny. Focusing on the present, the soapy water, the steady rhythm of her hands, she would prove worthy of this chance. She would labor diligently, be grateful, and not disappoint him. The saloon doors burst open, momentarily diverting her attention. A boisterous group of cowboys, even rowdier than Hank, swaggered in, their spurs a noisy counterpoint to the saloon's hum. Sarah instinctively recoiled, her grip tightening on the plate. She risked another look at Clay. He hadn't moved. He remained in the doorway, a silent, watchful presence. However, something shifted. His stance was subtly altered, his shoulders squared, his eyes narrowed slightly. He looked protective. The newcomers settled at a table, their laughter and raucous banter filling the saloon. Sarah returned to the dishes, her heart thrumming against her ribs. She couldn't predict what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. A hope that perhaps she could carve out a space for herself in this unforgiving land. And maybe, just maybe, the notorious Calamity Clay held the key to unlocking it. Earning respect. The first few days were a blur of scalding water, chipped plates, and the ever-present din of the devil's breath. Sarah's hands, soft from a life spent mostly indoors, quickly roughened, protesting the constant immersion. Each night, she collapsed onto the straw-stuffed mattress in her tiny room, every muscle aching, the saloon's cacophony still echoing in her ears. But with each passing sunrise, a quiet resilience bloomed within her. She learned the rhythm of the saloon, the ebb and flow of customers, the particular quirks of each cook. Jeb, initially gruff, began to offer curt nods of approval when she anticipated his needs, fetching him clean towels or refilling his water pitcher before he asked. He even, one particularly chaotic evening, tossed her a greasy, half-eaten biscuit, a gesture Sarah understood as high praise. The saloon patrons, hardened men and women weathered by the harsh landscape, initially treated her with indifference, their eyes sliding over her as if she were just another piece of the saloon's worn furniture. But Sarah, with her quiet diligence and unwavering work ethic, slowly began to chip away at their apathy. She remembered their names, their usual orders, even the way some liked their coffee, black as sin and strong enough to stand a spoon in. One grizzled old prospector, Silas, known for his surliness and tendency to spit tobacco juice indiscriminately, started leaving her a small pile of fool's gold on the counter near the dish rack. "For luck, girl," he'd grumble, avoiding her gaze. Another evening, a card player with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, known only as Deuce, offered her a peppermint stick stolen from a traveling salesman. Sarah found herself smiling more often, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, chasing away some of the shadows that clung to her. The work was hard, but it was honest, and it was hers. She was building something brick by brick in this unlikely sanctuary. One morning, as she prepared to tackle the mountain of dirty dishes, she noticed something unusual resting atop her cleaning bucket. A small bouquet of wildflowers, larkspur, Indian paintbrush, and a single, vibrant sunflower tied together with a piece of twine. They were wildflowers, the kind that grew in the hidden meadows beyond the town limits. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around the saloon, but no one seemed to notice her or the small splash of color brightening her corner. Jeb was bellowing orders at the cooks, Deuce was nursing a whiskey at the bar, and Silas was engrossed in a game of checkers. Clay was nowhere to be seen. Throughout the day, she couldn't shake the image of those wildflowers. They were a small, unexpected act of kindness, a gesture that felt both personal and deeply unsettling. Who would leave her such a gift? And why? That evening, as she scrubbed the last of the dinner plates, she saw him. Clay was leaning against the doorway to the kitchen, his arms crossed, his face unreadable in the dim light. He wasn't looking at her directly, but she felt his gaze, heavy and intense, like a physical weight. "The work suits you," he said, his voice low and rough. It wasn't a question, but a statement. Sarah paused, her hands still submerged in the soapy water. "It's honest work," she replied, keeping her voice steady. He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked closer, stopping just a few feet away. The scent of leather and gunpowder clung to him, a stark reminder of the world he inhabited, a world she was now, however tenuously, a part of. "Honesty is a rare commodity in these parts, Miss Meadowsweet," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers. They were the color of storm clouds, swirling with a darkness that both fascinated and frightened her. "Don't let anyone take it from you." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the saloon, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts. The wildflowers, the quiet observation, the cryptic words, what did it all mean? Was he testing her? Protecting her? Or was he simply playing a game, with her as the unsuspecting pawn? She looked down at her hands, raw and red from the day's labor. They were the hands of a dishwasher, a survivor, a woman trying to carve out a new life in a world that seemed determined to break her. And yet, those hands also held the fragile bouquet of wildflowers, a symbol of hope, of kindness, of something she couldn't quite name. The mystery of calamity Clay deepened, wrapping around her like the swirling dust devils that haunted the desert landscape. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her future in the Devil's Breath was inextricably linked to this dangerous, enigmatic man. And she couldn't help but wonder what price she would ultimately have to pay. Hank's revenge. Hank nursed his whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the bitter brew of resentment bubbling inside him. Sarah Meadowsweet. The name tasted like dust and defeat. He'd seen the way she looked at Clay, a naive mix of fear and fascination. Clay, who barely acknowledged the rest of them, had left her wildflowers. Wildflowers? Hank spat into the sawdust-covered floor. That was his job. He was supposed to be the charmer, the one who brought the girls trinkets and sweet words. He pushed the glass further down the counter towards Jeb, the blacksmith, whose face was permanently dusted with coal. "She thinks she's better than us, that fancy city girl." Jeb grunted, unimpressed, and continued polishing a horseshoe. "She washes dishes. And she washes them damn good." Hank bristled. "That's not the point. She's got clay wrapped around her little finger. Mark my words, she's trouble." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Heard she ran from something back east. Probably a husband she murdered or worse." Jeb finally looked up, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Worse? Gambling debts, maybe? Stole from her own family? Who knows what kind of filth she dragged in with her?" Hank let the implication hang in the air, thick and heavy like the saloon smoke. The seed was planted. The next day, Sarah noticed the shift. The casual nods she'd earned from the regulars were gone, replaced by sidelong glances and hushed whispers. Even Bess, the cook, seemed less chatty, her usual gruffness amplified by a palpable coolness. She scrubbed the plates harder, the soapy water stinging her chapped hands. The rumors, whatever they were working. She could feel them swirling around her like a dust devil, threatening to suffocate her. During her lunch break, usually a solitary affair by the back door, she found the spot occupied. Two of the saloon girls, Lily and Rose, were huddled together, their voices dropping to a near whisper as she approached. They stopped talking abruptly, their faces flushed. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, hoping to pass without incident. Lily smirked, a cruel glint in her eye. "Just admiring the scenery, newcomer. Something you wouldn't understand." Rose giggled and Sarah felt her cheeks burn. She retreated inside, the half-eaten apple turning to lead in her stomach. The sanctuary of the kitchen felt smaller, the clatter of pots and pans amplifying the silence that had fallen between her and Bess. That evening, while sweeping the sawdust from the floor, she overheard a snippet of conversation between two cowboys at a nearby table. "Ran off with the preacher's money, said she was a widow, but her husband's probably rotting in some shallow grave." Sarah's breath hitched. The words were vague, but the implication was clear. Hank's lies were spreading like wildfire, consuming her fragile hope for a new beginning. She gripped the broom handle so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she walked back to her room, the shadows seemed to lengthen, twisting into menacing shapes. The familiar creaks and groans of the saloon sounded like mocking laughter. She felt utterly alone, exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt since everything back east. She bolted the door, pushing her meager belongings against it for added security. The single window offered little comfort, revealing only the vast, indifferent expanse of the night sky. She knew with a chilling certainty that Hank wouldn't stop until she was gone. And Clay, the man who had offered her a glimmer of hope, was nowhere to be seen. He was a ghost, a shadow, a presence that lingered but never truly materialized. Was his protection just an illusion? A cruel joke played on a naive girl desperate for salvation? She huddled on the cot, the coarse blanket scratchy against her skin. The scent of wildflowers, faint and fading, was a painful reminder of the promise that now seemed irrevocably broken. The devil's breath, once a haven, had become a prison. And Hank, fueled by his petty resentment, was the jailer. Secrets and shadows. Fear, sharp and acrid, stung Sarah's palate. The whispers had amplified into jeers, the stares now felt like physical blows. Hank's malice had infected every corner of Devil's Breath, transforming her refuge into a cage, and she was done enduring it. She found him at the bar, back turned, meticulously buffing glasses. A palpable aura of smugness radiated from him. "Hank," she began, her voice strained, close to breaking. He remained unmoved. "Well, if it isn't the scullery maid, come to admire the master at work?" A dry, rasping chuckle followed. Sarah edged closer, fists balled at her sides. "Why this? What did I ever do?" Hank pivoted, eyes glinting with undisguised spite. "Do? You sashayed in here, all wide-eyed innocence, and filched what was mine by rights." Clay's attention, his regard. The final word was spat like venom. "That's not true." Her tone sharpened, gaining volume. "He simply offered me employment." "Oh, he offered more than that, didn't he? That look? That doe-eyed appeal?" He parroted her expression, his voice thick with derision. "The one that makes men instinctively protective. But I see through the charade, Sarah Metasweet. I know what you're concealing." A chill snaked down Sarah's spine. She hadn't divulged her true name to anyone. Not even Clay. How could he? "The past has a way of resurfacing, little songbird," Hank continued, dropping his voice to a low, menacing purr. "And yours? Well, it's particularly unsavory. I've been making inquiries. A few discreet letters, some cleverly phrased questions." He let the implication hang, a dark cloud. "You know nothing," Sarah retorted, but the words rang hollow, her complexion paling to chalk. "Don't I?" Hank invaded her space, closing the distance. Stale beer and cheap liquor clung to his breath. "I know about the incident, the one you fled from, the secret you're so desperate to keep submerged." A cruel, triumphant smirk etched itself onto his face. These folks wouldn't take kindly to a woman with your history, least of all under Clay's protection. Panic seized Sarah, constricting her throat. He knew, he genuinely knew, the secret she had guarded with such vigilance, the one that haunted her days and poisoned her nights, was on the verge of exposure. Her newfound existence, the tentative hope she had dared to nurture, was about to collapse. "If you breathe a word," she started, the threat faltering on her lips. Hank seized her arm, his grip unexpectedly powerful. "Oh, I'll do more than breathe it. I'll broadcast it, unless—" He paused, predatory hunger blazing in his eyes. "Unless you do something for me." Sarah struggled to wrench free, but his grasp only tightened. "Release me." "Not until you grasp the gravity of the situation," Hank hissed, his voice a viper's strike. "One word from me and you're exiled. Or you could rectify matters. Convince Clay you're not worth the trouble, that you bring nothing but misfortune. Leave, and I guarantee your little secret remains interred." Desperation surged through Sarah, a tidal wave threatening to drown her. He desired her departure. He craved Clay's undivided attention once more, and he was prepared to shatter her to achieve it. She stammered, her thoughts colliding, searching for a solution. Suddenly, a shadow eclipsed them. The temperature plummeted. Hank's grip slackened involuntarily. Clay stood behind them, eyes like polished obsidian. He remained silent, yet his presence alone was enough to quell the room. The raucous din evaporated, replaced by a tense, uneasy quiet. Every eye in the saloon was riveted to the unfolding drama. Hank, Clay's voice rumbled, a low, dangerous growl released the lady. Hank's Adam's apple bobbed nervously, his bravado dissolving like smoke. He released Sarah's arm with agonizing slowness. Clay, I was simply... Clay advanced, his gaze unwavering, locked on Hank's face. The air thrummed with unspoken menace. You were what, Hank? Harassing my employee? Peddling falsehoods? Or perhaps menacing a woman? Hank stammered, unable to meet Clay's piercing stare. I intended no harm. Clay picked up a glass from the bar, his movements precise and deliberate. He scrutinized it as if searching for a flaw. Then, in one swift, brutal motion, he crushed it within his fist. The sound of splintering glass reverberated through the hushed saloon. He unfurled his hand, letting the shards cascade to the floor. A crimson trickle snaked down his palm. Words are like shattered glass, Hank, Clay murmured, his voice barely audible. Once uttered, they cannot be retrieved. And sometimes they inflict wounds far deeper than you realize. He paused, his gaze intensifying, a palpable threat. Disseminate any more rumors about Sarah. Threaten her again. And I assure you, the next item I shatter will not be glass. He turned and strode away, leaving Hank paralyzed with fear behind the bar, his face drained of all color. Sarah watched him depart, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was speechless, unsure of what to do. She felt simultaneously terrified and strangely shielded. But at what potential cost? A shared truth. The silence after Hank's hasty retreat was thick enough to choke on. The swinging doors of the Devil's Breath slapped gently against their frames, the only sound in the suddenly cavernous space. Clay hadn't moved, his gaze still fixed on the empty street where Hank had disappeared. Sarah, however, felt his attention like a brand burning on the back of her neck. She cleared her throat, the sound amplified in the stillness. Thank you, Clay. He finally turned, his expression unreadable. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, making it impossible to decipher what he was thinking. He won't bother you again. It wasn't a question, but Sarah felt compelled to respond. He knows about what happened. The words felt like shards of glass in her mouth. Clay walked towards the bar, his spurs clicking softly on the wooden floor. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting in the dim light. He downed it in one gulp, then turned back to her. I know. The admission hung in the air. Sarah's breath hitched. You, how? He shrugged, the movement surprisingly graceful for a man of his size. Word travels. Especially when it's fueled by whispers and half-truths. Sarah's stomach churned. So he knew. He knew about everything. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows and become invisible. Are you going to tell everyone? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Clay's brow furrowed. Tell them what? That you're a survivor? That you did what you had to do? He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. I'm not interested in your past, Sarah. I'm interested in your future. His words surprised her. They were delivered without judgment, without condemnation. There was only curiosity, and something else she couldn't quite name. But you know, she stammered, unable to meet his gaze. You know what I did? He reached out, his large hand gently cupping her chin, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. I know that a cornered animal will fight to survive. And I see a woman who's still standing, despite everything she's been through. That takes courage, Sarah. More courage than most men I know possess. His touch sent a jolt through her, a mixture of fear and something akin to comfort. She had expected revulsion, disgust, perhaps even anger. But she saw none of that in his eyes. Only a strange, unsettling understanding. Why, she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. Why are you doing this? Why are you protecting me? He dropped his hand, the sudden absence leaving her skin tingling. He turned away, walking back towards the bar. Maybe I see something in you that I recognize in myself. He didn't elaborate. He busied himself polishing glasses, the rhythmic clinking a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Sarah. She really watched him for the first time. Not just the fearsome outlaw, the man with the reputation for violence, but the man beneath the surface. She saw the weariness in his shoulders, the shadows under his eyes, the subtle lines etched around his mouth that spoke of a life lived hard. There was a loneliness about him, a palpable sense of isolation that mirrored her own. Perhaps that was why he had offered her shelter. Not out of some grand gesture of altruism, but out of a shared understanding of what it meant to be an outcast. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The saloon felt different now, less menacing, more intimate. The weight on Sarah's chest hadn't completely lifted, but it had eased slightly. Clay knew. And he didn't care. It was a strange, unsettling freedom. I should have. I should get back to the dishes, she said, breaking the silence. He nodded without turning around. Get some rest, Sarah. You've had a long day. She hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked towards the back of the saloon. As she disappeared through the doorway, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just glimpsed a different side of Calamity Clay, a side that was far more complex and far more dangerous than his reputation suggested. And she had a feeling that her life in Devil's Breath was about to become even more complicated. Under siege. The night after Clay's disquieting confession descended on Devil's Breath, a palpable weight stifling the usual revelry. The tinny piano and boisterous laughter at the Devil's Breath saloon felt diminished, forced. Even the cloying scent of stale beer and cheap perfume seemed to cling with a heavier insistence. Sarah attacked a grease stain on a tankard, Clay's words echoing in her mind. He knew. Yet, instead of condemnation, she'd glimpsed acceptance? A heady, perilous mix. The saloon doors exploded inward, showering the room with splintered wood. A storm of bullets tore through the air. The piano player yelped, scrambling beneath his instrument. Glassware detonated, scattering crystalline fragments across the floor. Morgan's gang, someone bellowed above the chaos. Sarah instinctively dove for cover behind the bar, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the abrupt end to her new life, not a whimper, but a cataclysm. Peeking cautiously, she saw 4 men, faces twisted in fury, unleashing lead at Clay, who stood stock-still for a heartbeat, an eerie serenity masking his features. Then, with astonishing swiftness, he drew his revolvers and answered the volley. Panic threatened to drown Sarah. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing herself invisible. But Clay, exposed and vulnerable, flashed in her mind. Something ignited within her. She couldn't cower. She groped for anything to defend herself. Her fingers closed around the hefty iron skillet she'd used for stew. A pathetic weapon, but better than nothing. As one of Morgan's men lunged forward, firing at Clay, opportunity bloomed. Leaping from behind the bar with a strangled yell, she swung the skillet with every ounce of her strength. It connected with his skull. A sickening crack. He collapsed, senseless. The remaining attackers spun around, surprise widening their eyes. A mere barmaid, daring to fight. Clay, jarred by Sarah's sudden intervention, snapped back to focus. He exploited the distraction, felling another of Morgan's men with a precise shot to the thigh. Hesitation flickered across the faces of the remaining 2, their bluster receding. One, a hulking brute with a scar cleaving his face, leveled his gun at Sarah. "You'll pay for that, girl." Before he could pull the trigger, Sarah flung a fistful of silverware. It was a reckless, idiotic gesture, but it granted her a vital reprieve. Clay seized the moment, his bullet finding its mark. The scarred man howled, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The last assailant, witnessing his comrade's fall, lost all stomach for the fight. He bolted, vanishing into the inky night. Silence dropped like a shroud, thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder. Sarah stood there, panting, skillet gripped tight, knuckles bone white. She surveyed the devastation, fractured glass, toppled tables, blood marring the floor. Clay slowly reholstered his revolvers, his gaze fixed on Sarah, his expression indecipherable. He moved toward her, boots crunching on the broken debris. "Well, Sarah Metasweet," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, "I'd say you're more than just a dish scrubber." Sarah swallowed, her throat parched. I just wanted to help." "Help?" Clay quirked an eyebrow, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "That was more than assistance, girl. That was grit." He plucked a splinter of glass from her hair. The other patrons, who had been huddled in terror, started to emerge, their faces ashen. Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the room. "She saved us, she did," someone exclaimed. "That little thing floored a Morgan's man with a frying pan." The whispers enveloped Sarah, a blend of awe and incredulity. She felt a bizarre surge of pride, tinged with a profound disquiet. She had reacted without thinking, driven by pure reflex. But now, the weight of her actions settled upon her. She had revealed a side she'd striven to suppress. Clay placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Go wash up, Sarah. You've earned it." His eyes held a glimmer she couldn't quite place. Gratitude? Respect? Something deeper? As Sarah retreated toward her cramped room, she felt Clay's gaze tracing her every move. The night's turmoil had irrevocably shifted the dynamic between them. She was no longer simply the unassuming dishmaid. She was something else entirely. Something dangerous. And she sensed that Clay, more than anyone, understood this. The attack had been a crucible, forging a strength she never suspected she possessed. But had she revealed too much in the process? And what would Clay do with this newfound knowledge of her true self? These questions tormented her as she scrubbed away the grime and blood, the sensation of being besieged clinging to her long after the echoes of gunfire had faded. A new dawn. The morning arrived stained with hues of faded rose and violet, like a watercolor bled onto a canvas marred by the gray smudge of distant fires. Sarah stirred in Clay's bed, the unfamiliar room a stark reminder of the prior night's brutal intrusion. He was gone. The linen beside her offered only a whisper of his wood smoke and leather aroma. She pushed herself upright, her body protesting the unaccustomed strain of shouldering a shotgun. Below, the devil's breath hummed with quiet activity. Patches already concealed the gunshot wounds to the walls, and upturned furniture stood upright once more. Miraculously spared, even the piano received Maggie's meticulous attention, her lips pinched in concentration as she worked. Clay stood sentinel at the bar, nursing a glass of dark liquor. He met Sarah's gaze as she descended, his typically flinty eyes softened with an uncharacteristic tenderness. "Morning," he rasped, his voice gravelly. "Morning," she echoed, the word hesitant. The echoes of the previous night crackled in the space between them, a tenuous connection forged in the crucible of fear and shared action. He nodded toward a stool. "I figured you could use something stiffer than coffee." After a moment's pause, she perched on the offered seat, watching as he poured a generous measure of whiskey. No empty reassurances, no hollow promises of better days. He simply slid the glass across the polished wood. "You were extraordinary last night, Sarah." The spirit burned a welcome warmth as it traveled south. "Didn't seem like much of a choice," she countered. A low chuckle vibrated in his chest. "Choice is a funny beast. Has a way of making itself for you." He paused, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've been doing some thinking, Sarah." A knot tightened in her stomach. I care for you," he confessed, the words sounding as though they'd been wrestled from some deep, reluctant place. "More than I thought I could. I know I'm a handful, but it's real, whatever this is." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't the hardened guardian, but a man exposing a raw nerve. The dread that had clung to her since her arrival began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative bloom of hope. "Clay," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I care for you too, more than I believed possible." A slow, transformative smile touched his face. It was a far cry from the dangerous smirk she'd become accustomed to. This was open, guileless. He reached for her hand, his rough palm enveloping hers. "Then maybe," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the saloon's quiet murmur, "maybe we could build something here." In the ensuing days, a subtle shift occurred within the devil's breath. Not a jarring revolution, but a gentle softening of its rough edges. Wildflowers, plucked from the harsh landscape, graced the tables. The once monotonous fare gained new zest, imbued with the flavors of herbs Sarah coaxed to life in pots by the window. Clay, too, seemed to be evolving. Still the imposing figure of an outlaw, yes, but a newfound gentleness flickered in his gaze whenever he turned it upon Sarah, a protectiveness that transcended simple duty. Even his smiles came more freely, genuine expressions that transformed his face. The saloon mirrored their blossoming bond. The usual boisterousness and occasional fracas persisted, but interwoven within them was a sense of camaraderie, of shared purpose. The devil's breath evolved into a sanctuary, a place where drifters and misfits could find a moment of peace, a warm meal, and a kind word. One evening, bathed in the fiery hues of sunset, Sarah rested on the porch swing beside Clay. The air, sharp with pine and sage, held a welcome chill. "It's beautiful here," she breathed, leaning into his shoulder. "It is," he rumbled, his arm tightening around her. "But it's a damn sight more beautiful with you." Contentment warmed her as she nestled against him. The devil's breath was no longer solely an escape from her former life, but a haven, a refuge erected on the foundation of love and shared aspirations. A place where second chances were handed out, where hope put down roots in the most barren of soils. "What do you think Morgan will do?" she asked, breaking the comfortable quiet. Clay sighed, the sound heavy. "He'll be back. He ain't one to swallow a loss easy." After a pause, he added, "But this time we'll be ready for him." She knew he spoke the truth. The shadow of her past, of Morgan, remained a looming threat. But she was not the naive woman who had first stumbled into the devil's breath. She had grown stronger, more resilient, and she had Clay at her side. And as one, they would confront whatever the future held. As the darkness deepened, the warm glow from within the saloon spilled onto the porch, casting dancing shadows in the gloaming. Inside, the lively sounds of music and laughter testified to the enduring power of hope amidst a world shrouded in darkness. The Devil's Breath had transcended its mere existence as a saloon. It had become a sanctuary, a guiding light in the unforgiving wilderness, thanks to a mail-order bride and an outlaw brave enough to gamble everything on the promise of love.